sight of when reading the Gospels, but especially the Gospel of Mark, is we tend to read it as stories. We tend to read it as what's called a narrative genre. A narrative genre is someone, a writer, the author, in this case St. Mark, saying a narrative. This person did this, then did that, and then encountered this, and so on and so on. So it reads like a very factual story. And I say especially St. Mark because St. Mark, unlike the other Gospels, is very action-oriented, very fast-paced. Why? Why do we say that? A couple of things. I know Dr. Samir touched on, I know Abuna touched on. Number one, his constant use of the word immediately, ephthes in Greek, and then immediately. St. Matthew comes a little close with his words, his use of the word behold. He says behold a lot, okay? But St. Mark is immediately, one thing after the other. That's point one. Point two is, you'll notice in St. Mark, the Lord does not have a lot of long speeches. He doesn't have sermons the way St. Matthew does, the way St. John does, and the way St. Luke does. And so there's a tendency to read that gospel as stories, one thing after another. Oh, this was a nice parable, this was a nice event, this was a nice miracle. And the danger of reading the gospel that way is you miss out on what the gospel was intended as. And the gospel was intended as a theological statement, a theological narrative. Not a narrative in the way you would say any story or any narrative, but a theological narrative. Why theological? Because it's explaining who was Christ. If I were to go and preach the message of the risen Lord, the first thing I have to say is, who is Christ? Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus of Nazareth? And there are different ways to do that. St. Paul, for example, after his encounter with the risen Lord, he preached orally at the synagogues, and then he wrote letters to the churches. And in his letters, you find out a lot about Christ, who he was, his divinity, his humanity, his love, his redemption, his ransom. And you're finding out a lot of depth to who was Christ by virtue of his letters. Some letters are pastoral, i.e., St. Paul is talking to one of his disciples, St. Timothy, about a particular issue. Some letters are pastoral in the church sense. The church in Corinth was having a ton of problems. And so he was, as the apostle who was at Corinth, helped them out with their problems. But in his letter, you get a sense, and he talks about the body of Christ, he talks about the unity of Christ, and so on and so forth, right? That's called the epistolary format. It's letter writing. The gospel genre is different. The gospel genre tells you about Christ in his action, in his doing, what he said, what he did. But you have to ask, what is the narrative telling me about Christ? Why did St. Mark write this way? Was it just because that was his style? One of the things that struck me is, and you won't get this from the Gospel of St. Mark, is that he was, and I quote one of the biblical scholars, a master theologian. That, because you're just kind of reading story and story and story. So that's one of the things I'm going to try to emphasize during this talk, is I'm going to try to point out some of the, maybe less focus on verse by verse, and more so focus on why the placement of a particular scene this way, or one of the important details that St. Mark mentions that maybe are not in the other Gospels. Why are they not in the other Gospels? Because it may not have been important to the theology of St. Luke, or not the theme that he's trying to emphasize, and so on. Make sense? Yeah? If it gets too boring, then definitely raise your hand, and I'll still keep going, but at least I'd like to know the feedback. Sorry? Yeah, it would be nice. Okay. Thank you. Excellent. This way, if you throw anything at me, I can just hide under the... Okay, so we said Mark chapter 3. Can anyone set the scene for us? Do we remember what happened in 1 and 2? Where is the Lord during this time? Anybody remember? Who was here last time? I wasn't here, but I read I read Mark 1 and 2. It's not that interactive. Okay. Let me set the scene for you. Mark 1, what happens? The baptism. He starts out with John the Baptist and the baptism of the Lord. Then immediately he goes temptation on the mount. Then what happens? Then he starts his ministry where? Where? I heard something. Galilee. Very good. We're going to talk about geography. Geography is very important. And I think to modern readers, we tend to gloss over geography. But again, think, how is this theologically important? Why is St. Mark mentioned Galilee? Like, why is this important? Why is he talking about the north and the south and the Sea of Galilee and Capernaum? Like, what's the point? What else? What else happens in Mark? So that pretty much takes us to Mark, the end of Mark 1. Then there's the miracle. What happens? What's the first miracle in Mark? I can't hear you. Oh, isn't there a mic? What? Before the healing of the paralytic. The demon-possessed man. The demon-possessed man, and the Lord commanded him specifically not to say anyone to anything. Okay? But notice that the demon-possessed man was the first to acknowledge him as the Son of God. Okay? One interesting detail we'll come back to is, where did this happen? Maybe if we turn to Mark 1. Who has a Bible? Where? No, but where specifically? He mentions the synagogue. The synagogue. Very good. He goes to the synagogue. Okay, where's this? So we're all reading it the same. Where? Chapter 1, right? Yeah. So it happens at the synagogue. Okay? Why did this happen in a synagogue? Why does it happen in a synagogue? Again, very important detail. We'll come to in a second. Because chapter 3 begins again where? Do we know? At a synagogue. Okay? These details are important because Mark is not just saying them because that's a very nice way to construct his story, but he's coming back to the idea of the synagogue over and over again. Okay? Then we get into Mark 2, and he gets, the Lord heals the paralytic man, and then he gets into a series of disputes. Disputes about fasting, about the Sabbath, and that takes us to chapter 3. Okay? Now, chapter 3, actually, let me just say one thing about chapter 2. Chapter 2 ends at with a very shocking statement. And if you were at the time of St. Mark and you heard the words that the Lord said, you would be shocked. You would be, in fact, so shocked that chapter 3 says, and we'll get to it in a second, that those who were with him thought he was crazy. Thought he was crazy. No other gospel writer except St. John mentions that his followers thought he was insane. Okay? Do you see how shocking that is? What's the shocking thing he says? He says at the end of the chapter in his dispute about the Sabbath that the Sabbath was made for man, and the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Who is the Son of Man? Do we know? Did we talk about that last time? Did we talk about this idea of the Son of Man? What does that mean? No. Okay, good. If I'm repeating stuff, please, you have to tell me just because there's a lot to cover. The Son of Man. The Son of Man is a very, very important title, and it has an ambiguous meaning. The Son of Man can mean a human. Just like it says in Psalm 8, for example, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the... Who knows Psalm 8? It's the one after Psalm 7. Or before Psalm 9 if you're using that version of the Bible. Exactly. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yeah, I'm trying to find a hike. Okay. Okay? So the Son of Man can simply be just a human being. Okay? Ezekiel, in his vision, is called the Son of Man many, many times. When God talks to Ezekiel, he says, Son of Man, go this way, do this way, take a measuring stick and measure this way, and the temple that you see, do this. Son of Man, Son of Man, Son of Man. So a Son of Man could just mean a person. Okay? The Son of Man can also mean, it could be a reference to Daniel 7. Okay? And that was a very apocalyptic title. And you have to think of this, yes. Good questions, I love it. So I genuinely didn't hear that. So, yeah.
When you say Son of Man, do you mean from our point of view or from their point of view? Like post-New Testament or pre, I guess?
Well, that's what I'm trying to say. You're raising a good point. There's something when you're reading the Bible called